The spring air over the steppes west of Izum seemed deceptively peaceful. Behind the lines, work was in full swing. Sappers hastily built bridges. Artillerymen moved guns into pre-prepared positions. Staff officers spread maps on tables on which the future victory was already drawn with red arrows. It seemed that just a little more, a few more days of tension, and the large industrial center held by the enemy would return to control, and the entire campaign in the south in the 18th year of the war would turn in favor of the Red Army. Reports going up the chain of command expressed confidence and even optimism. The operation was ready, forces were concentrated. The enemy, according to intelligence estimates, was weakened and barely holding a stretched front. But on those same maps, if one looked closer, something troubling was noticeable. A salient in the front line, deeply cutting westward, vulnerable flanks, weak units covering vital communications, and emptiness in sectors where it was assumed the enemy was incapable of delivering a serious counterattack. For Semyon Timoshenko, the commander of the direction, the upcoming operation was more than just a local offensive. The recent successes near Moscow were still fresh in memory, when in the harsh winter it was possible to push the enemy back from the capital and, for the first time in a long time, turn the tide of events. It was proven there that the Red Army could not only hold but also attack, refuting the myth of the invincibility of German troops. Now it was necessary to consolidate this success, to turn it into a stable trend. The plan, born in the headquarters, promised exactly this: a swift strike from the Barvenkovo bridgehead and from the north, bypassing a key strongpoint, encircling a large enemy group, and liberating a crucial industrial center whose factories had recently worked for Soviet defense, but now served the other side. The Stavka, Supreme High Command, by early spring was already living with the idea of initiative. The successes of winter seemed to prove that the enemy was exhausted, its reserves depleted, and the wave of the Red Army's offensive could engulf several directions at once. This mood contained the first paradox of the future disaster. Confidence in their own capabilities was combined with a noticeable underestimation of the enemy's flexibility and resources. Moreover, the southern direction was seen as the key to major economic targets, to important raw material extraction areas, and to strategic communications leading to the Volga and further into the interior of the country. If the large hub in eastern Ukraine could be regained, the entire configuration of the front would change in favor of the Red Army. The plan of the operation looked logical on paper. From the Barvenkovo salient, a bridgehead that Soviet troops had held since the previous winter, several armies were to strike, advancing northwestward towards a large city and a crucial railway hub. Simultaneously from the north, from the area of Belgorod and Volchansk, another group was to move south. Ideally, two crushing arrows would converge, enveloping the enemy's 6th Army from the western side and cutting it off from the main forces. After this, as it was envisioned in the headquarters, the enemy would have neither the ability to hold the city nor a chance for an organized retreat. Reports emphasized that the enemy's defenses in this area were stretched, and its reserves, according to intelligence estimates, were mainly concentrated in other sectors. However, these calculations contained a dangerous oversight. The enemy viewed the map differently. For the German command, this very Barvenkovo salient had long seemed not so much a threat as an opportunity. The deep westward protrusion created a break in the front, which could be cut off from the main forces by an attack from the south and north, and turned into a vast trap. In the Wehrmacht headquarters, a plan was brewing, code-named, the essence of which was to contain the Soviet offensive on the city with limited forces, and to preserve the main strike groups for a powerful blow to the base of the salient. This plan had not yet been implemented, but preparations were underway, and it was all the more surprising how confidently the Soviet side believed that the enemy would diligently defend the city and not look for an opportunity to strike at the most vulnerable spot. The dilemma facing the Stavka in the spring was a choice: to continue active defense, accumulate forces and wait for the enemy to launch a major offensive himself, or to try to impose their will on him by striking first. Memories of the heavy defeats of the previous year, when the initiative belonged entirely to the enemy, were too fresh. Against this background, faith in the offensive impulse seemed not only a military but also a political decision. To show its population and allies that the Red Army was capable not only of discussing defense meant a lot. But it was in this combination of military calculations and political expectations that a dangerous tendency arose to overestimate one's capabilities and underestimate the enemy's preparedness. The spring in the area of the future clash was difficult. Roads became impassable. The movement of heavy equipment was complicated, and crossings required serious engineering preparation. Infantry units had to move through viscous steppe soil, and artillery had to look for positions from which they could fire with sufficient stability. Logistics, on which great hopes were placed, already showed its limitations at the stage of troop concentration. Railways and highways did not always manage to provide the strike groups with everything necessary. However, in reports to the top, these difficulties were often smoothed over, presented as temporary and surmountable. Few dared to openly question the entire design of the operation, understanding how important it was for the overall strategic background of the spring of '42. Within the command vertical in the southwestern direction, a special atmosphere was developing. Marshal Timoshenko, appointed to lead this sector, enjoyed authority, and next to him was a member of the military council, Nikita Khrushchev, whose role in making political and operational decisions was also significant. The military council of the direction was under dual pressure. On the one hand, the expectations of the Stavka and the country's leadership personally; on the other hand, the objective state of the troops and their preparedness for a complex operation. At this time, front and army commanders were required not only to execute directives, but also to demonstrate initiative, without appearing cautious or prone to excessive defensiveness. The fear of being accused of disbelief in the army's offensive capabilities pushed many to support optimistic assessments. Personal motives and internal doubts played no less a role in this story than the dry figures of operational summaries. For Timoshenko, the successful conduct of an operation near a major Ukrainian city would have meant strengthening his reputation as an offensive commander, capable not only of fulfilling but also anticipating the desires of the Stavka. For Khrushchev, it was an opportunity to demonstrate political and organizational acumen, to build the image of a leader closely connected with the front and understanding its needs. But the hierarchy of that time did not encourage open discussion of risk. Within the headquarters, officers involved in intelligence, logistics, and operational planning could see weaknesses in the plan, but their voices dissolved in the general chorus of optimistic reports. The opposing headquarters viewed the same map without this layer of political expectations. For the German command, the southern direction also held key significance, but their approach to assessing the situation was more pragmatic. The salient held by Soviet troops in the Barvenkovo area was seen as a potential source of major operational gain. If it were possible to cut off this salient with an attack from the south and northwest, several Soviet armies would immediately find themselves encircled. Subsequently, this would open up the possibility for a deep operation to the south and southeast, towards important transportation hubs and rivers that were the arteries of the entire Soviet rear. In German plans, This maneuver became a preparatory step for an even larger campaign on the southern flank of the front. The paradox of the situation was that both sides based their plans on the same geographical element, the Barvenkovo bridgehead, but saw opposite things in it. The Red Army saw a springboard for an offensive, while the Wehrmacht saw a potential trap. And it was each side's confidence in the correctness of its own assessment that made the impending catastrophe almost inevitable. If one of the sides had been more cautious, if the attack had been postponed, or, conversely, the German counterattack had started earlier, the configuration of events might have looked different. But the chronology unfolded in such a way that the initiative formally belonged to the Red Army. The operation began on May 12th, earlier than the planned start of the German strike on the base of the salient. The morning of May 12th was marked by a powerful artillery barrage. Soviet artillery, concentrated in key sectors, opened fire on enemy positions, creating a dense wall of fire. Following this, infantry units, reinforced by tanks and supported by aviation, went on the attack. Initially, the offensive developed as expected by the headquarters. In some sectors, the enemy's front line was breached, defensive positions were swept away, and individual Wehrmacht units retreated, not always managing to consolidate on intermediate lines. Reports to the top spoke of significant tactical successes and advances to the west. It seemed that the intended encirclement from the south and north was indeed beginning to materialize. But within a few days, it became clear that the pace of the offensive was significantly behind schedule. By May 16th, the troops of both strike groups had only reached the lines that were supposed to be occupied on the third day of the operation. There were many reasons for the delay. Firstly, the enemy's defense in certain sectors proved to be more resilient than expected, and protracted battles had to be fought for settlements and heights. Secondly, coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often failed. Equipment sometimes moved ahead, leaving the infantry without cover, or conversely, the infantry stalled before insurmountable strongholds, waiting for support. Thirdly, logistics, already strained during the concentration phase, now often failed to deliver ammunition and fuel in the required volumes. A particular problem was the training and coordination of mid-level command personnel. Officers who had received accelerated training in previous years now had to manage complex operations requiring clear coordination of many units and formations. In a rapidly changing environment, not everyone managed to correctly assess the situation and adjust tasks in time. Communication was unstable, orders were sometimes delayed or lost, and feedback from the front reached headquarters with a noticeable delay. As a result, the overall management of the offensive gradually lost flexibility, and initiative on the ground was often taken by commanders guided not so much by the overall plan as by the immediate tactical situation. Meanwhile, the enemy closely watched the unfolding events. The fact that the Soviet side launched an offensive earlier than the planned strike on the base of the Barvenkovo salient did not destroy the German plan, but only introduced adjustments to it. On the northern face of the front, where enemy units held the defense, an order was given to stubbornly contain the Red Army's offensive without revealing major reserves. In the south, however, shock groups, including powerful tank corps, began to concentrate. They were to strike at the most vulnerable point of the Soviet formation, the left flank and rear of the troops advancing from the Barvenkovo bridgehead. The morning of May 17th became a turning point. After a brief artillery preparation, German tank formations attacked the positions of Soviet troops on the southern face of the salient, where units significantly weakened by previous battles held the defense. The enemy managed to relatively quickly break through the defensive lines and penetrate deep for a significant distance, cutting off important communications and the railway line connecting a major city with Krasnograd. This was not just a local advance. There arose a threat that the entire Barvenkovo bridgehead would be cut off from the main forces, and the advancing group would find itself in an extremely difficult position. At this moment, the Soviet command had a choice. Immediately stop the offensive on the city, transfer part of the forces and reserves to eliminate the breakthrough, try to stabilize the front in the south, and prevent the formation of a large encirclement. However, the logic of political and operational expectations continued to push for the continuation of what had been started. At the highest level, there was still hope that the breakthrough would be localized, and that the main goal, the encirclement of the enemy's 6th Army in the vicinity of a major city, would still be achieved. The order to cease the offensive operation would follow only on May 28th, when the operational situation would already become practically irreversible. Meanwhile, the ring around the Barvenkovo group tightened. The enemy, advancing from the south, linked up with units operating from the northwest and gradually closed off the external retreat routes. Soviet units, continuing their advance, suddenly discovered that their rear was under attack and their communications were cut. Attempts to regroup forces ran up against limited time and resources. Troops located deep within the salient gradually found themselves in an area that could no longer be called a stable front line. Rather, it was a growing cauldron within which individual formations and corps tried to hold the defense and seek ways out. For the commanders of the formations caught in this zone, the internal conflict acquired extreme sharpness. On the one hand, they were bound by orders to hold positions and continue to carry out the original task. On the other hand, it became clear to them that a threat of large-scale encirclement was looming. Individual commanders made attempts to break through to the east, organized local counterattacks, and sought to restore lost communications. But the enemy had already managed to bring up significant forces, and its aviation was actively working along routes that could have become corridors for retreat. Each day lost reduced the chances of the Barvenkovo group maintaining its organization. By May 26th, the picture had become clear even to the most optimistic staff officers. The encircled troops found themselves squeezed into a relatively small area around Barvenkovo, where the density of units and artillery reached its limit. Attempts to break through to them from the outside yielded no results. From the outer perimeter, Soviet army structures tried to launch strikes to break the encirclement, but the enemy had already managed to entrench themselves on advantageous lines, using heights and control over key roads. Inside the encirclement, desperate efforts were made to break out of the trap, but each such surge met with concentrated fire and the enemy's air superiority. Marshal Timoshenko's order to cease the offensive operation, issued on May 28th, was a belated attempt to formalize what had essentially already happened. The offensive had bogged down. The Barvenkovo salient had ceased to be a bridgehead for attack and had turned into a trap. Now, the focus shifted from completing the encirclement of the enemy's 6th Army to saving at least a portion of their own troops. Attempts to organize a breakthrough continued until the end of the month, but the situation worsened daily. The ring tightened, resources dwindled, and overall command became increasingly difficult. The total losses of Soviet troops in this operation were heavy. Various sources cite different figures, but generally, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of personnel irrevocably lost or incapacitated, tens of thousands of small arms, thousands of artillery pieces and mortars, and hundreds of tanks lost during the fighting. Some estimates speak of approximately 300,000 irrecoverable losses. Others specify that over 200,000 people were trapped in the cauldron and taken prisoner, and that the total losses of the two Soviet fronts reached almost 300,000 people. But it was not just about the numbers. Structurally, several armies and a significant portion of tank and cavalry corps were routed. The troops that formed the striking force of the southwestern and southern fronts lost their combat effectiveness, and many formations simply ceased to exist as organized structures. This meant that the southern flank of the Red Army was weakened and exposed over a vast extent. It was this fact that opened the way for the enemy's further strategic operations, leading to major rivers and crucial industrial regions. At the level of ideas and military concepts, the Kharkov catastrophe of '42 raised a question that would return again and again. Where is the line between necessary offensive activity and dangerous adventurism? Soviet strategy of that period was based on the need to impose their will on the enemy and prevent them from calmly preparing new strikes. But at the same time, underestimating the real balance of forces, ignoring the weaknesses of their own communications, and excessive belief in the successful development of the offensive led to a result opposite to what was expected. The idea of a decisive offensive, instead of strengthening the position of the Red Army, led to a failure that weakened it in a key direction. On a personal level, this battle became a trial for many military commanders. Timoshenko and his inner circle found themselves in a situation where they not only had to explain the reasons for the failure to the Stavka, but also to bear political responsibility. In society and in the army, little was said for a long time about the details of this catastrophe, with attention focused on other events and victories. However, for those who went through the Barvenkovo trap, the topic remained painful. The internal conflict between a sense of duty, the desire to fulfill an order, and the understanding that the plan would lead to a tragic outcome became part of the personal history of hundreds of commanders of various ranks. The philosophical meaning of the Kharkov cauldron manifests itself in a series of paradoxes. The first of these is the paradox of confidence. The stronger the leadership believed in its initiative and ability to impose its will on the enemy, the less prepared it was for the possibility that the enemy might have their own, equally well-thought-out plan. The second is the paradox of geography. The very bridgehead that was considered a successful result of winter victories and perceived as an advantageous starting position turned out to be the weak point of the entire front configuration. The third is the paradox of time. The desire to preempt the enemy and strike first led to the Red Army finding itself at a disadvantage precisely when the enemy was ready to launch a counterattack. There is also a broader, civilizational layer of meaning. The Kharkov operation of 1942 shows how dangerous it is to replace a sober assessment of reality with ideological expectations. When a military plan becomes part of a political narrative, any doubt about its success can be perceived as weakness or disbelief. In such an atmosphere, the feedback mechanism, so important for a complex management system, becomes damaged. If staff officers are afraid to voice unpleasant data, intelligence is adjusted to fit the desired picture, and commanders on the ground are forced to choose between an honest assessment and career safety. Strategic errors become almost inevitable. For a contemporary viewer looking at these events decades later, it is important to see in the Kharkov cauldron not only an episode of a great war, but also a lesson for any large system: states, armies, corporations. One of the main lessons is that complex decisions cannot be made based solely on mood and political impulse. It requires honest analysis, a willingness to hear unpleasant assessments, and the ability to admit that sometimes it is more advantageous to abandon an enticing but risky plan. Another lesson is the need to constantly consider the vulnerabilities of one's own position. What seems like a winning bridgehead today can turn into a trap tomorrow, if the enemy or competitor sees a different function in it. No less important is the lesson at the operational and tactical level, which remains relevant in modern conflicts. The Kharkov operation showed how critical for the success of an offensive are the quality of interaction between different branches of service, the training of middle command personnel, and the stability of communications and logistics. Even with a bold plan and significant forces, without a well-oiled system of command and support, advancement inevitably begins to falter. And when an offensive unfolds slower than planned, it becomes vulnerable to counterattack, especially if the enemy carefully monitors its pace and looks for weak spots. If one looks at the events of 1942 through today's prism, another important aspect emerges: the attitude towards losses and the consequences of strategic errors. At that time, official narratives tried to smooth over the scale of the failure, emphasizing heroism and self-sacrifice. Today, however, it is much more important to see not only the feat, but also the reasons that made this feat necessary. Understanding the mechanisms that led to the catastrophe allows for the construction of more resilient management systems, where the price of error is not measured by such heavy figures. The Kharkov cauldron became a prologue to further events in the southern direction. The weakening of Soviet forces created conditions for the enemy to launch a large-scale campaign aimed at the southern seas, resource-rich regions, and major transport arteries. Following the May disaster, the enemy advanced relatively quickly over a significant distance, almost without encountering organized resistance in an area that had recently been considered a powerful stronghold of the Red Army's defense. This was one of the factors that led to the severe trials the country endured in the second half of 1942. And yet, it cannot be said that this lesson passed without a trace. Already in subsequent operations, Soviet command began to pay more attention to flank defense, the stability of communications, and coordination between fronts and reserves. The experience of the Kharkov catastrophe, however much they tried for a long time not to bring it to the surface, was taken into account in the preparation of major defensive and offensive operations that subsequently turned the tide of the war. The understanding that confidence in one's own strength cannot replace systemic planning became part of a new approach that was gradually forming within the command environment. When we return to the initial picture, to those maps on the staff tables, to the red arrows cutting through the front line, it is no longer possible to look at them with the same optimism. Now, in each of these arrows, one can discern not only the hope for success, but also the shadow of a future trap. This is the main paradox of the Kharkov cauldron. It began as an attempt to turn the situation around, as a bold offensive that was supposed to show the maturity of the Red Army, and ended with the collapse of an entire flank and the opening of the way for new enemy strikes. And at the same time, it was precisely through this catastrophe that the system was forced to learn, at its limit, on the brink, at a cost that today seems unbearably high. For a modern person listening to the story of the May operation of '42, it is important not only to remember dates and names. It is important to feel how ambition and fear, confidence and delusion, design and reality intertwine in this story. The Kharkov cauldron is a reminder that in large systems, one cannot with impunity ignore the alarm signal, cannot fit facts to a desired picture, and cannot consider the enemy short-sighted. And if, at the beginning of the narrative, we saw the spring air over the steppe as a symbol of hope, now it appears differently, as a space in which any arrow on the map must be checked more than once before living people follow it.